Hello and welcome to class. Today is Monday, May 17th, and we are just starting off our second week of PS 2410 Introduction to Public Policy. I hope you all had a restful weekend and that you are enjoying summer even though we are still in class. It's always nice to get some kind of break, or at least a break in the weather. So, this week we're going over Chapter 2 of the Birkeland book, and we are going over the first half of part 1 of the Bardock book. And then we're also going over the Burstein article that I will post shortly after class so you can review it, though it will not be on the quiz. So just the Birkeland and the Bardock will be on quiz 1, which will be posted shortly after I post this today, May 17th, and it will be due Friday, May, 20th? 21st, by 11:59 p.m. And generally all of your quizzes will be like that. You'll have about 4 or 5 days to do them, and then they'll be due. So, let me go ahead and just get into what we're doing, because that's basically all of the business we need to go over. So, Chapter 2 of the Birkeland is about the elements of the policy-making system, of which there are many. And generally, we think about the policy system as we do in systems theory with inputs and outputs, and we think about things like the structural environment, the social environment, the political environment, and the economic environment, and we're going to go over all of those different things today. So, it's important to note that Birkeland characterizes the policy system as a policy cycle in terms of several stages, such as issue emergence, agenda setting, alternative selection, enactment, implementation, and evaluation. So the first stage is issue emergence, when people realize that a problem has gone too far and something needs to be done about it, particularly by the government. And this can come to light in a number of ways. Generally, we think about issues emerging at times that we call focusing events, such as when a natural disaster happens, or a terrorist attack, or an unjust shooting, or something like this. And this mobilizes people into interest groups who then push for policy change, and this brings issues onto the agenda of the policymakers, onto which they go on to agenda setting. So, agenda setting is all about making sure you're figuring out how we get from issue emergence all the way to evaluation through implementation and the like. And agenda setting involves setting out the stages of your path to implementing and evaluating a policy, so from start to completion. Alternative selection is when we realize we have a variety of options to choose from, and then we determine through evaluative criteria which is the best solution to a policy problem, and then we decide on it. And then we get into enactment, where we put the policy into place. Officially, we codify it either in a law or a statute or something like this, and then it can be said that the policy is enacted. And then implementation is all about setting out what the policy intends to do in the real world. And that's generally carried out by lower level bureaucrats, and we'll talk about the different kinds of actors there are, both official and unofficial, in the policy making system, in, I think, 2 weeks. And then finally, the last stage of the policy cycle is evaluation, where we determine how well the policy's implementation met the policy's initial goals that were set out by legislators and other policymakers. We determine whether we learned anything from the policy and how it was implemented, and if we need to make any changes to the policy, or to revoke it entirely, or to continue with it. So, characterizing the policy process as a policy cycle is both a descriptive and a prescriptive enterprise. And what we mean by that is that it both states how the policy cycle actually works, and it states how the policy cycle ought to work. But there is a critique that this implies that the policy making proceeds step by step, and that it may not reach each stage. along with the idea that the stages cannot be separated from each other. So in the real world, we find that this characterization of the policy process as a cycle that Birkeland does, and other theorists indeed too, it's not just Birkeland, who characterize the policy process as a cycle, may not be getting at the heart of what policymaking actually entails. Maybe some of the steps don't get accomplished. Maybe some of the steps run together and really kind of become a fusion of two steps into one. Maybe only two of the steps happen. But there are other ways of characterizing the policy process, and we'll talk about those when we talk about different theories of the policy process near the end of the course. However, this book uses the stages model, which is the policy cycle model, because it remains a helpful way to structure our thinking about the policy process as a metaphor, however imperfect. So it's just a generally good criteria to align ourselves with when we're determining how policy is made. It gives a general analysis and a general prescription for how policy making actually does get done and how it should get done. So, when we're talking about the policy process as going on in stages in a cycle, we want to talk about systems thinking. And systems thinking is a way of thinking about natural or social phenomena as a system in which various inputs into a system are handled, processed, and interact with each other to create a set of discernible outputs. So what are some of the different inputs? Well, we have public opinion, we have legislators' opinion, we have interest groups' actions, we have actions by citizens and both members of government and other policymakers, and then our outputs that come out of all of those inputs interacting together include actual policies, the results of policies, etc. So you have inputs and outputs. And the input-output model of the systems thinking is a model that assumes a set of policy demands or inputs, which are then processed by the political system into laws, programs, and goods and services government provides. So that's just another way of thinking of the inputs and the outputs. However, the main criticism of this system is that it treats the political system as a black box where the internal workings are unexplained. So you may be familiar with the term black box, but the general idea is that it has inputs and outputs, but we don't really know what goes on in the middle. How those inputs turn into outputs and the like. And it's also important to note that the public policy process is a product of, but it also influences the policy environment. So the policy environment includes everything that has to do with policy and all of the different things that influence what policies are made. And the policy process is a product of the environment, but it also influences the policy environment. And this is kind of why we think about the policy process as a cycle, because it's reinforcing itself. So now we're going to talk about the different environments that characterize the policy process. And the first type of environment that we're concerned with is the structural environment. And the basic structural features of the American government include the separation of powers into legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and the system of state and federal government known as federalism. So, I'm sure you guys are all very well read on your physics, or not physics, civics. So you know about the separation of powers in the government between the legislative branch, executive branch, and the judicial branch. And these all influence policy in different ways. So the legislative branch is responsible for actually making and codifying laws, while the judicial branch is responsible for determining whether laws are constitutional or not, and whether they are just. And the executive branch has special powers relating to policy, such as the ability to declare war or to declare state of emergency, etc. And also the power of veto. And it's important to note here that the government structure is not strictly formal. It's a structural environment that involves rules about how government goes about its business. And some of these rules are such as the rule that the government has to have open public meetings, which allows for meetings and hearings to be open to the public in decision making. This allows for citizen feedback, approval or disapproval, etc., and very strongly influences what laws are actually made. There's also the Administrative Procedure Act, which is a federal law that requires regulatory agencies to follow procedures in rulemaking, such as public notice of new rules, public comment periods, etc. So it's a very important act regarding how things need to go administratively, which is a huge part of public policy making. And then there's also the Freedom of Information Act, which is a federal law that allows citizens to gain information about government programs. So we know through this that certain documents that the legislature makes, or really all of them, are available to the public. And so are broadcasts of legislative meetings through C-SPAN. So now we're getting into the social environment, and the social environment involves the nature and composition of the population and its social structure. And we know that demographers are concerned with the social environment, and that they are individuals who study the composition of the population by looking at demographic features such as race, age, gender, and other attributes. And one of the things demographers do is take a census every 10 years. We just had ours last year, which allows for a vast amount of demographic data, and these are good indicators of social trends which have an important influence on public policy making. So you may wonder why it's important to take the census, and it's important to fill it out accurately and honestly so that policymakers know the demographic composition of our environment. Why is that important? Well, you may think that, age, race, sex, gender, occupation, etc. does not matter when it comes to the provision of policymaking. However, all of these different demographic features affect not only who policies specifically are meant to target, but they are indicators of populations that need to be reached, and also of populations that are being adequately served. And this is important for constructing policy and making sure it's implemented in the right areas and for the right people. And we note in this section of the Birkeland that America has a growing population, but it's also an aging population. And this is true when we compare the United States to other countries such as Japan. However, the slow growth rate means that the nation is trending towards an older population. So not as many people are being born as many people as there are people dying, essentially. But also, a better way to say that is that more people are living a lot longer than they were compared to the amount of people that are being born and the amount of children there are generally in society. So what does this mean? This means that certain social services that are enacted through policymaking need to be implemented to meet the needs of an aging population. There needs to be greater provision for things like Social Security, medical benefits, etc. And that's not really a policy position. That's more of a recognition of a problem. But you see that even in me saying that, I'm making a normative statement. And this is where we get back to the descriptive and prescriptive. Some people might think that just because we have an aging population does not mean that we need to provide more social services to the elderly. But it is generally accepted that people ought to get the services that they need. There's just a distinction between people who believe that they should get them in a certain way and versus people who think they should get them in another way, or people who think that only certain people should receive benefits from the government while other people shouldn't. And these generally fall along party lines, of course, although there are variations within the parties themselves. However, I stand by my statement. It's not too controversial of a statement to say that the older population needs more attention in policy making. There's a lot of indication that our aging population is not receiving the attention that it needs. So, insofar as we accept the premise of the argument that the government ought to provide services to the people that need them, then it's easy to accept the conclusion that the older population needs more services tailored toward them. Just because that's who the population is now. So then we get into a discussion about race and ethnicity in the Brooklands, and we note that historically the population of the U.S. consisted of the descendants of European immigrants with a substantial African American minority population. However, by the late 20th century, the ethnic and racial composition of the nation's population was changing in important ways. So, for example, the self-identified Hispanic population grew from 12% of the population in 2010 to 18% in 2017, and it's growing just as rapidly now. And many people are becoming more willing to self-identify as two or more races, which indicates that the categorization of race and ethnicity is becoming more nuanced and complex. And this comes up in the census again, because one of the census questions, I believe, is are you Hispanic or not Hispanic? And for some reason the government deems that as an important marker of your demographics. And there are problems with this relating to the differentiation between people of the Hispanic ethnicity, and also with self-identification as a member of a minority, with respect to the idea that some people may not want to state what their race is on a census form, regardless of their race. So that's basically where the Brooklyn leaves it off. And then we get into a conversation about the gender and labor force participation, with Brooklyn first noting that the gender distribution of the nation's population has remained relatively stable for the last 50 years. However, what's changing is that the proportion of men in the workforce has declined from 1960 to 2017, while the proportion of women with paid employment increased for all women from 1970 to 2000. So less men are working and more women are working. And about 60% of American women now work, whereas about 73% of American men now work. So that's it's interesting to note that's a pretty high rate of unemployment that follows from that. Also, although some people may not be categorized as unemployed for whatever reason. And it's also interesting to note that there still is a discrepancy between the amount of men working and the amount of women working. However, the general trend is that more women are working now than there were before, while there are less men working now than there were before, with about a 50-year gap. And so you may be wondering why we're talking about all these different demographics and their changes over the past 50 years or so. And it's because the demographic change matters for the workforce, immigration, and intermarriage issues. And an aging population means an increased number of people relying on Social Security and other old age benefits, as well as private pensions and health insurance claims and care needs. So getting back to the diverse needs of an aging population, more people are claiming Social Security now, such that some people are wondering whether it's a sustainable program. And more people are claiming their pensions and making health insurance claims, and they also have higher claims of need relating to health and other human services. And now, what's interesting that goes with that is that many people anticipate having to work past the typical retirement age of 65 in the wake of the Great Recession. So while people may be claiming Social Security more, some other people may not be claiming Social Security as much, or at least not until a bit later than 65, or much later than 65 in many cases as well. So we have an aging population that's working for longer than they used to. And we note that the United States will continue to grow at a faster rate than nearly all the European Union nations because of a somewhat higher birth rate and because of the flow of immigrants. So we're referring to also not only people having more babies, but also because immigrants are coming into our country at a high rate. And ethnic and racial groups, lines, and disparities are changing, and so there are questions about how that will affect policy issues. So I want you guys to think about how the changing composition of American demographics will affect public policy. That may be a quiz question. So now we're getting into the political environment, and public opinion polling data helps policymakers and other participants in politics assess their political and policy options. And it's important, especially in a democratic nation such as the United States, for public opinion to affect policymaking, because we are essentially a sovereign nation and we have a participatory form of government. Public opinion is highly valued in a democracy, as the public is who gets to choose which laws will be enacted, or in some cases, or who our policymakers and legislators and presidents, etc., other members of government will be. And that's what the Berkstein article that I'm about to post focuses on. But again, you won't be quizzed on the article because I didn't give you enough time to review it. But I apologize for that. I'll make sure to post the articles in time before. But if I ever post something late, then it won't be on the quiz. At any rate, the article tracks how closely public opinion actually influences public policy. And the overwhelming conclusion is that it really does, to a great degree, at least 3/4 of the time. So that's pretty amazing. And pollsters have asked people to list what they consider to be the most important problem, or MIP, on the national agenda for years. And there's a little explanation of what the most important problem was according to people over the last several decades. And you see how the most important problems changes from civil rights matters to macro in 1965 to macroeconomic concerns and international affairs in 2004. However, I would argue that many people think the most important problem of 2021 is civil rights affairs. So it's interesting how things come back and fall to the wayside on the agenda. But yeah, what would you think is the most important problem? Maybe I'll make that a discussion question. And the question reflects the important issues on the government's agenda, and therefore reflects the area in which we're most likely to see the most public policy activity. And this goes back to the stages of the policy cycle. So we have issue emergence and then agenda setting right next to each other. Issue emergence leads to agenda setting. And when problems become more noticed and talked about in the public's eye, or in the public's opinion, then they often become more noticed and talked about by government officials and onto the government's agenda. And then, therefore, we're more likely to see change in those areas. And another way to think about the most important problem is to think about what the national mood of the government is, of people regarding the government is. So the national mood, according to Kingdon, is how we feel about government's handling of public problems. And it can be either generally positive, neutral, or negative, depending on the economy and trust in political institutions, leaders, and processes. And it tends to fall after recessions, which are periods of economic contraction in which the value of the gross domestic product declines for 2 consecutive quarters, and depressions, which are particularly severe recessions. So this makes sense. You'd think that the national mood would fall after depressions and recessions. Also tends to fall after natural disasters, sometimes after elections, or it can be raised after elections, or it can be raised after natural disasters, depending on how the government handles it. So it really depends on how the public thinks the government is handling the particular most important problems of the era. And the national mood and trust in government is important for public policy because the legitimacy of democratic political systems depends in large part on the extent to which the electorate trusts the government to do what is right, at least most of the time. And this was a statement or a quote by Erber and Lowe, who are political theorists. So, why do we care about the national mood? Why do we care about people trusting in government? Well, it's an indication of how well our democracy is functioning. If the people can't trust the government to do what they think it should, or they think the government is doing things that it shouldn't, then the national mood and trust in the government will fall. And that's indicative of a failure in our democracy with respect to adequately anticipating and responding to people's desires, needs, etc. And how they think, which problems they think should be handled by the government and how they should be handled by the government. So policymakers care a lot about these sorts of things. Now we turn to the economic environment, which includes the growth of the economy, the distribution of wealth in a society, the size and composition of industry sectors, the rate and growth of the economy, inflation, and the cost of labor and raw materials. And the most common measure of economic activity is the gross domestic product, or GDP, which is the total value of all goods and services produced in a country. Generally, we can compare countries' relative wealth by comparing their GDPs, so that's why this is important. And economic factors influence policy making because they constrain the environment in which policies are made. And it's important to think about how economic factors and the economic environment constrains the environment in which policies are made. Well, first of all, we know that policies require capital, money. We know that to implement policies successfully, we often need large sums of money, billions or millions of dollars. And so if this money isn't available to the government, it isn't available to the people to pay through taxes to the government, or the government otherwise doesn't have enough money, then they're unable to adequately implement policies. And Berkland brings up John Maynard Keynes here, and Keynesian economics suggests running budget deficits during recessions so as to stimulate the economy, and then when the economy is growing, tax revenues can pay the debt so incurred. So this is just a theory of how best to manage the economy by the government. And Keynesian economics has been proven to be successful in many iterations of American government, particularly in the 70s to the 90s, and still today in some regards. So, in this way, we see that public policy choices are influenced by the economy, but the policy decisions and the daily operations of government also influence the economic environment. And approximately 51% of all money collected in taxes by the federal government is returned to the economy as transfer payments to citizens. And transfer payments are transfers of money from the government to individual recipients, such as through farm subsidies, disaster relief, and various social welfare programs. And we also know that tax policies influence economic behaviors. For example, through allowing a property tax break on mortgages. If you have a mortgage, you generally get a property tax break. This incentivizes people to buy more houses. So that's just one way in which tax policies influence economic behaviors. And tax expenditures are government payments or subsidies in the form of tax deductions or credits. Finally, we note that the conception people have of their economic well-being has a significant influence on their political outcomes and beliefs. And so we see differences in political party alliances between people who are less wealthy and people who are more wealthy. There are people who are less wealthy who align with either party or any other party in the same way that people who are more wealthy. But generally, we see some alignment between someone's economic well-being and the party they choose. And the unemployment rate is the percentage of the eligible workforce in a state who are looking for work but cannot find it. And then finally, income inequality exists and has substantial political and economic implications. And I included the note of the Gini coefficient here. According to the Root Institute, the ideal is between 25 and 40. And so the Gini coefficient is a number assigned to a country on a scale from 0 to 100, with 0 being no economic inequality and 100 being a lot of economic equality. So they claim that the ideal is between 25 and 40. And you have to think about why they're claiming this. Why would it be more ideal to have more economic inequality? Well, some people think that incentivizes people to work. Some people, but then there's a lot of people who think that there shouldn't be any economic inequality because people are entitled to, the same wage regardless of whatever work they do. So it really depends on your political ideology. But I think what their criteria for evaluating what rate of economic inequality is best is based on which stimulates the economy the best. But we could also think about, which rate of economic inequality is the most just. And that might be a different ideal level. So now we get into inputs and outputs. There's a lot of information on inputs in the Birkeland. And the inputs are generally, of the policy process, are generally activities of unofficial actors who are generally actors outside the government itself. So any citizen who isn't directly involved with the government is an unofficial actor. That's one input. Election results is another input. And we know this is important because voting is the most common form of political participation. Elected officials and the news media often proclaim the results of elections as providing policy guidance or mandates to pursue particular policies. So, depending on what the results of elections are, different policies are pursued. Not only because we elect people at different parties to different positions, but also because policymakers use the results of elections as indicators of the national mood or the most important problem on the agenda, and an indication of which policies they ought to pursue or which ones they ought to avoid. And we note here that interpreting voters' policy preferences in elections for public office is notoriously difficult because different people have different reasons for voting for different candidates. Why might this be the case? Well, maybe someone voted for Donald Trump in the last election because they aligned with his political beliefs. Maybe someone voted for Donald Trump because they thought he would make the best policies. Maybe someone thought they aligned with Donald Trump because he just seemed like a good guy to them. And similarly, the same could be said for Joe Biden's voters. So it's not always easy to determine just through election results, why a person voted for someone. Just that they voted for someone is all that can clearly be determined without particular polls determining the national mood, and etc. However, we generally think that our election-based system gets at the heart of what people really think and feel, but that can be debated. Another input is public opinion, and this can be determined through public opinion polls, particularly those conducted by or in conjunction with academic institutions such as Gallup, Roper, Lewis Harris. which are national polling firms that look at electoral preferences, but also important public issues or general political questions. Another important input is communications to elected officials and public managers, such as through letters and emails to elected officials. So this is a really important way to influence the policy process. If you're particularly invested in a policy issue, then you can write to your congressman. Members of Congress receive thousands of phone calls, letters, faxes, and emails every year, and they use the overall trend of letters to gauge public opinion, and this may lead to action on issues, although it may not. However, congressmen and congresswomen often cite letter writing campaigns, etc., or particular letters they received that were particularly salient to them as reasons for voting a particular way on an issue. Another important input is interest group activity. And we note here that interest groups have a bad name in American politics, but they are key actors in the policy process. And you can argue whether the bad name that the interest group name connotates is deserved or not. But regardless of that, it's important to note that they have a lot of influence in public policy. And groups wield more, and that's because groups wield more power than individuals. And then the final input that the Birkeland notes is the news media, who are important participants in policymaking as they highlight some issues while de-emphasizing others, and can therefore shape the public discourse surrounding policy issues. And in public opinion expressed in the media is an important but imprecise gauge of how the public and community leaders are thinking about issues. So it's important to note that the news media is an important input on the policy making process. However, the opinions expressed in the media are variable and may just belong to particular individuals. So it's important to take what's said in the news media as with a grain of salt when you're trying to determine what the public opinion is on a particular issue. For example, if the news is covering a particular issue, they may only interview one person, and that generally only gives a really imprecise gauge of how all the community leaders in a particular area on a particular issue feel about it. And then we get into outputs. Generally, we think about laws when we think about outputs, and so we have different types of laws that we'll go over, such as statute laws and case laws, and regulations. So statute laws are defined as the laws that are drafted and passed in the legislature and codified. But case law is also important in the policy output of the government with respect to the judicial branch, because it sets precedents that are often followed for a long time. Case law refers to when a particular person or group raises a problem with the government, and it often gets brought to different levels of court for mediation, or arbitration, I should say. And then regulations are the rules made by the government agencies and regulatory bodies to implement the meaning of the laws under which agencies operate. And just so we know, the basic definition of outputs is the basic statements of public policy that reflect the government's intent to do something. Whether they actually do something is an outcome. And we'll talk about the difference between outputs and outcomes. And we get to oversight and evaluation, which is another output of the government. And oversight is an increasingly important function of Congress, and it involves overseeing programs that Congress has already enacted to ensure they are being run efficiently and effectively, following legislative intent, and which is what the legislature meant in drafting legislation. And it's related to oversight is policy evaluation, which is the process of investigating whether and to what extent a program has its desired effect. So oversight is essentially about the points in the policy cycle where we talk about implementation and evaluation. how are these laws that were codified going to be implemented in particular ways by bureaucrats and street level bureaucrats, and then in evaluation, how well did they meet their goals. And when we're talking about how well laws implementations, the implementation of laws meets its goals, we need to think about legislative intent, which is what legislators particularly meant when they codified laws or regulations. Okay, that's it for Birkeland Chapter 2. Sorry, my nose is a little itchy. Now we're getting into Bardock, Part 1, pages 1 through 47, which is the first 4 steps of the Eightfold Path to more effective problem solving. And you are going to use the Eightfold Path to more effective problem solving in your policy analysis paper. And you will also be quizzed on the steps. So pay attention, if you will, please. So in these 8 steps, Bardock proceeds from defining the problem to making a decision and explaining it at the end in 8 steps. We're going to cover 4 of the 8 steps today, and the steps are listed on slide 18 of the first PowerPoint I uploaded under week 2. But step 1 is define the problem, which gives you a reason for doing the work and a sense of direction for your evidence gathering activity. And then there are various tips. So essentially, in defining the problem, you're laying out all of the relevant evidence that shows that the problem you're talking about is actually a problem. This may be descriptive or normative, or both. But generally, you're going to want to include statistics and relevant facts from news articles, etc., to explain what your problem is and why it's important, why it needs to be brought to the government's attention. And then step 2 is about assembling evidence. So this is where you get into the nitty-gritty of the evidence. And you need to turn data into evidence in this step. And so Bardock here talks about how data are facts, information is data that has meaning, and evidence is information that affects the existing beliefs of important people about significant features of the problem that you are studying and how it can be understood or mitigated. And you need evidence for 3 particular purposes, including assessing the nature and extent of the problem you are trying to define, assessing particular features of the concrete policy situation you are studying, and assessing policies that have been thought to have worked effectively in situations apparently similar to your own. So you're laying out what's worked, what hasn't worked in this step. You're laying out why this problem is a problem. And you're trying to kind of give a context for the extent of the problem that you're dealing with. And then in step 3, you construct the alternatives, and by alternatives we mean alternative policy options or courses of action. So you want to list all of the possible alternatives to this policy problem, generally including maintaining the status quo, and kind of explain what they would do and what they would take to do. And then in step 4, which is the last step we'll go over today, you talk about selecting the criteria. So after specifying the alternatives, you have to determine some way of choosing between them by selecting the criteria by which to judge them. So some commonly used criteria are efficiency, equality, equity, fairness, justice, freedom, community, rationality, openness, accountability, transparency. And these all mean different things that are discussed in the book. But generally, when we talk about efficiency, which is a really important criteria to use pretty much for any policy analysis, you want to talk about getting the maximum bang for your buck, getting the maximum outcomes for your inputs. Outputs for your inputs. So you think few inputs, lots of outputs. Or many inputs, but many more outputs. That's what we think about when we think about efficiency. We can also think about cost effectiveness. What costs less, that may be more efficient in a sense. But then when we talk about equity, we sometimes contrast this with efficiency. So efficiency is about getting things done in the fastest and cheapest manner, essentially. Whereas, although there's more complex ideas that go along with it. Whereas equity is about serving the right people in the right way. And it's not just about treating everyone equally, which is the criteria of equality, but meeting the needs of people in a way that solves each of their individual problems, however they be differentiated. So we can think about how efficiency and equity come into contrast. For example, efficiency for, let's say, a healthcare policy may be not providing as many subsidies as equity would require. Equity would say, well, to be the most equitable, we need to provide subsidies to everyone who can't afford healthcare. That's one way to define equity related to healthcare. Whereas efficiency would say, well, we don't have enough money to do so. To do so would come at a cost that's too great to bear for the government. So we're only providing them to people who meet, this income level or below. And not to people who are still less wealthy, but more wealthy than the lowest sector of society with respect to wealth or something like that. So you can see how these kind of criteria come into conflict, and that's where we get into confronting trade-offs between criteria and determining what the best course of action or the best alternative to take is in the later steps. Okay, hold on 1 second. Sorry, I just had to blow my nose. Excuse me, I'm still a little sicky. Yeah. Oh well. Hope you guys are doing better. So, now we're getting into the article that I'm about to post, which is The Impact of Public Opinion on Public Policy by Paul Burstein. And in the abstract, we talk about how the article considers the impact of public opinion on public policy. And how much impact does it have? How much does the impact increase as the salience of issues increases? So these are some of the questions the article aims to answer. To what extent may the impact of public opinion be negated by interest groups, social movement organizations, political parties, and elites? And has responsiveness of governments to public opinion changed over time? Can these conclusions be generalized? And the findings in general were, the impact of public opinion is actually substantial, and the salience increases the impact of public opinion. The impact of opinion remains strong even when the activities of political organizations and elites are taken into account, as well as interest groups. And responsiveness appears to not have changed significantly over time. However, they note that these conclusions should not be generalized just for geographic reasons. So, let's look at the impact of public opinion on public policy. We know that democratic governments sometimes ignore the public, even though they shouldn't. But how much impact does public opinion really have on public policy? Well, some people often think that it doesn't have that much because of the inherent limitations on the cognitive capacities of individuals and the organizational capabilities of Congress mean that responsiveness is likely to be only on the issues that the public cares about a great deal at any given time. And Zoller and Glynn argue that the public cannot be said to have meaningful political opinions at all. But what does the evidence show? It shows that issue salience increases the effect of public opinion on public policy, and issue salience is about how important a particular issue is to people at a time relative to other issues. So the most salient issue would be the one that people care about the most. So the idea is that the more people care about a particular issue, the more likely the government is going to respond to it. But then they also want to know, do interest organizations, political parties, and elites impede responsiveness at all? But they find that they don't. So perhaps interest groups ought not to have the bad name that they have, according to this article. So they found that 3/4 of the relationships between opinion and policy are statistically significant, meaning that they had a greater p-value than 0.05. I think that was the measure they use. Which basically the p-value rules out that the results of the statistics are significant or not. Whether the results are due to mere chance or whether the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable actually is there or not. So they found that 3/4 of the time, relationships between opinion and policy are statistically significant. So that means that 3/4 of the time, public opinion does have an impact, a statistically significant impact on public policy. And now they want to find out how robust is this relationship under a variety of circumstances. So with respect to issue salience and government responsiveness, they found that when salience is taken into account, the combination of salience and substantive public opinion always has an effect and is of substantial policy importance 3/5 of the time. With respect to interest organizations or interest groups, political parties, and elites versus the public, they found that when interest organizations are considered, the impact of opinion on policy is most likely to be statistically significant when more of them are involved. So the more interest groups that are involved in something we call an advocacy coalition for a particular issue, the more likely that their opinion is going to have an influence on public policy. And for political parties, the impact of opinion is statistically significant when they are involved as well. So if a political party has a particular opinion on an issue, then that is likely to result in policy codification, implementation, evaluation, etc. And for elite groups, the same result was found. So what they're saying here is that interest groups, political parties, and elites actually influence public policy, often in a way that edifies the opinion, the effect public opinion has on public policy. So they actually strengthen the relationship between public policy and public opinion. However, an area where they weren't as certain in their conclusions was in trends in responsiveness. So they wanted to answer the question, how has the government's responsiveness to public opinion changed over time? And the research here varies. Some show that it has decreased, while others show that it's increased, and others show that it's remained the same. So what do you think could account for this variation in research results? Just kind of a methodological question. And do you personally think that the government's responsiveness has decreased, increased, or remained stagnant over time? And when we come to generalizing across issues and politics, they write that our ability to generalize about the impact of opinion on policy is very much limited by the geographic narrowness of the studies and the range of issues studied. So they think because of the geographic narrowness of the studies, these results ought not be applied over different geographic areas. You could argue whether that should be the case or not. But they did find that the studies that compared governments found them to be equally responsive or unresponsive on a range of issues. Responsiveness is hypothesized to be higher on domestic issues than on foreign policy, as these issues are more salient to the public. You would think that the government would be more responsive to domestic issues than to foreign issues because the people care more about domestic issues than foreign policy. But the data didn't show any support for this hypothesis, so the government was equally responsive with respect to domestic issues and foreign policy issues. So in conclusion, public opinion affects policy 3/4 of the time. Its impact is gauged. Its effect is of substantial policy importance at least 1/3 of the time, and probably a fair amount more. Salience does affect the impact of public opinion on policy. The impact of opinion on policy remains substantial when the activities of interest groups, political parties, and elites are taken into account. The hypothesis that government responsiveness to the public has changed over time cannot be definitively rejected, and our ability to generalize about the impact of opinion on policy is severely compromised by the narrow focus of available work, both geographically and in terms of issues. So I'll probably ask the discussion question this week about how much you think public opinion influences public policy. Do you feel like the government is responsive to the salient issues of the public? Just something to think about. and you can cite evidence or not. But if you don't cite evidence, then I would like to see an argument. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. Good luck on the quiz. I'm sure you all will do great. And let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you next week. Bye.